139 of the Standing Committee on Public Accounts for the House of Commons.
Hybrid format pursuant to the standing orders. I believe members are all in the room, although some might join us remotely using the Zoom application. Before we begin, as we proceed, I'd ask members to look at the guidelines written on the updated cards on your table. These are there to help prevent audio feedback incidents and to protect the health and safety of all participants, including and especially the interpreters. A reminder that all comments should be addressed through the chair. Conformément à l'article 108.3G du règlement de comité.
Pursuant to Standing Order 1083G, the committee resumed consideration of Report 6, Sustainable Development Technology Canada 2024. Reports 5 to 7 of the Auditor General of Canada referred to the committee on Tuesday, June 4th, 2024.
For witness, a reminder that this committee has adopted a subcommittee report at our last meeting, and members have agreed to refer to this witness as Witness 1. I would ask that you comply with this decision of the committee. So without further ado, I will turn to Witness 1 for an opening statement. The floor is now yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the opportunity to speak before this committee as part of your study on the Auditor General's report on SDTC. The release of the Auditor General's report in June concluded a 2-year effort I initiated to expose how SDTC's idealistic mission was co-opted by a group of corrupt executives, board members, and insiders within the clean tech ecosystem. All or some, there's a lot of speech here. Frankly, I'm embarrassed to be here because me being here is an indication that the systems that are set out to protect people don't work. That's the biggest issue here, and I'll continue on my speech, but I want to make it clear that I'm here not just for SDTC, but point out that this should not have taken a 2-year effort to get to this point. And even to this day, real accountability doesn't exist. The Auditor General's findings conclusively validated and vindicated every single one of the issues I initially raised. Within hours of the report's publication, the Minister dissolved SDTC, a clear indication of the severity of the misconduct. This decision should serve as further proof that SDTC was beyond repair, with corruption that was so badly ingrained that it rendered the organization unfixable. It also serves as the ultimate indictment against SDTC's leadership, who continue to work today. I'd like to extend my gratitude to the Office of the Auditor General for its dedication to this inquiry and their wider efforts as one of the few independent institutions in Canada that continue to uphold public trust in a system that has become increasingly opaque and unjust. And just as I was always confident that the Auditor General would confirm the financial mismanagement at SDTC, I remain equally confident that the RCMP will substantiate the criminal activities that occurred within the organization. Again, I accepted this invitation to come to this committee because I'd like to talk about the actual effort that was required to get to this point and what the continued lack of action by the federal government indicates about our society. Because the real issues extend beyond SDTC's collapse. The true failure of the situation stands at the feet of our current government, whose decision to protect wrongdoers and cover up their findings over the last 12 months is a serious indictment of how our democratic systems and institutions are being corrupted by political interference. It should never have taken 2 years for the issues to reach this point, and what should have been a straightforward process turned into a bureaucratic nightmare that allowed SDTC to continue wasting millions of dollars and abusing countless employees over the last year. The first government official that I approached was the Liberal Member of Parliament for Calgary-Skyview, George Chahal, at an SDTC event all the way back in May of 2022. He assured me that he took this situation seriously and guaranteed that he would facilitate contact with the appropriate people in the federal government and the Auditor General's office. His subsequent refusal to engage forced us to spend the next 5 months trying and failing to contact various agencies, including ISED, the Ethics Commissioner, as well as the Public Integrity Commissioner, to name just a few. It was only in December 2022 that I finally contacted the Auditor General's office, which set off a chain of events that finally culminated in the report in June. It took almost a full year after we initially talked to the MP that this file eventually ended up at ISED, who then hired RCGT in March 2023 to conduct a fact-finding exercise. This fact-finding was supposed to be a 6-week exercise with a simple goal to just validate the documentations that I had provided, with a stated guarantee that subsequent investigations involving the AG, ISED, and the RCMP would be initiated if any of those documents and allegations were proven true. By May 2023, ISED had already confirmed most of those allegations. RCGT had even drafted a report and provided a debrief to myself, with ISED bureaucrats stating their plan to make a recommendation to the Minister and PCO that the report be released and that at least 4 separate investigations be initiated and managed through a newly created office within ISED. All of this should have led to immediate action, but once those findings reached the Privy Council office and the Minister's office, everything changed. The investigation was delayed for another 4 months, allowing SDTC to continue misusing funds and mistreat employees, where at this point the federal government had in fact known that this was true. By late August, ISED now confirmed that no further investigations were required, and instead there were plans to release the report, suspend SDTC, and remove the board and executive team immediately. This was the outcome I was expecting, and I was satisfied that this situation was finally going to be resolved. Yet the Minister and the government didn't act. ISED manipulated the findings, withheld the report from the public, and only suspended SDTC on a temporary basis with no plans to act against any single one of the wrongdoers, despite having overwhelming evidence to the contrary. The Minister himself defended his inaction, stating that RCGT's report was inconclusive, but if anyone read the legal disclaimers that RCGT themselves had written in the reports, it would actually state the contrary. The report explicitly stated that none of the findings and work done by RCGT could actually be used to prove or disprove misconduct. This delay and lack of action again let SDTC continue operations unchecked and continue them to allow misuse of taxpayer dollars. At this point, the AG's office informed me of their decision to act, and in response, I made the decision to whistleblow a second time, this time publicly releasing recordings that expose ISED's deliberate inactions and falsehoods. The fact that I had to act again speaks volumes about the depth of corruption, not just within SDTC, but within the government and bureaucracy. The government's failure to act promptly or transparently is not just a bureaucratic failure, it is a moral one. These revelations triggered further inquiries.
Excuse me, Mr. Witness, I'm going to have to stop you there because I think that's a good point. You're a little over your time, and I'm sure the members are going to have additional questions for you. So without further ado, I'll turn to Mr. Perkins for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Witness. If it wasn't for your ethics and bravery, frankly, over the last 2 years, and tenacity to expose this, we wouldn't be sitting here today in the previous meetings we have. So I think on behalf of everyone and all taxpayers, I thank you for the service you've done and continue to do. One of the areas I'd like to explore is around the former chair, Annette Basharian, and her desire to get money from SDTC to the Basharian Center at Cape Breton University. And I believe in a memo or an email that was written to Jennifer Smith from then VP of Investments, Zayed Rahim, who's now the acting president. He emailed her and said, I quote, Jen, this project is approved for fast track to the VCS, the committee, the analysis committee. Why would something be fast tracked, and how would that happen?
In usual cases, we would fast track applications that we clearly could see met all of the requirements for SDTC. I appreciate that you pointed this out because, you know, we've had a lot of board members and executives speak to these issues as simple mistakes of, you know, everything was just, we forgot to recuse ourselves and that was it. But examples like that are what actually proves the intent, because one of the clearest ways to actually show what was happening is the potential of how they were brought into the organization and the preferential treatment that was given to these projects. So for the Verschuren Center's application, there's no logic that anyone in the public could believe that this wasn't preferential treatment, because for the ecosystem stream of funding, that wasn't publicly known to anyone. So the public, who should have the ability to apply to something like the ecosystem fund, couldn't apply to it, yet she was getting fast-tracked.
I appreciate that. I've got limited time. Then on January 18th, the same vice president sent a note to someone named Beth saying it was rejected because of conflicts, and saying that we will help find funding from other avenues in government for that project. Did SDTC staff help Annette Verschuren find funding for this project and other projects from the government? As an example, $50 million went to Annette Verschuren's NR store from Natural Resources and $170 million from the Infrastructure Bank. And on top of that, the Verschuren Center got a total of about $6.6 million anyway from ACOA, ISED, and other programs. Were SDTC staff involved in helping her get government money from other departments?
They were, and that's something that SDTC employees aren't supposed to be doing. If an application gets rejected, you reject it and you point them to other organizations, but SDTC employees are not expected to actually go out of their way and spend their own time to actually help an organization get funding. So that was completely out of the realms of their regular day-to-day business, and it happened multiple times, not just the Verschuren Center.
So ACOA gave the Verschuren Center June 9th, 2022, $2 million, then again gave them another $4.2 million a little later on from ACOA. Then ISED gave the center $1 million, another $1 million, bringing that to about $5.2 million. And then the Verschuren Center got another $3.1 million from the ISED department. So it looks like the Verschuren Center got over about $10 million itself, and then another $220 million for our other projects from government departments. And she was using ISED or SDTC, the Green Slush Fund staff, to help get her projects money from the government?
Not for all of them. Again, this is just that one situation where after she was rejected, SDTC employees were asked, but you've also missed a couple more million because there's another entity called Engine, which ISED funds, that then indirectly funded the Verschuren Center. And one of the things I'd like to point out is there are almost 3 or 4 different public announcements announcing the Verschuren Center getting funding, and every single one of them announced the same exact project, even though that project and the outcomes of that project have already been completed and funded 3 times over by various federal agencies.
And the Ethics Commissioner found her to have breached the Conflict of Interest Act twice, he said in his report. But in committee this week, it turned out under questioning that he actually said it was 24 times in his, but he didn't have any of these projects in it. So clearly, Annette Verschuren's conflicts with SDTC were way more than 24, as were other directors like Guy Humet, André Lise Matteau, Stephen Kukucher, the list goes on. In fact, the Auditor General identified 9 directors in conflicts that did 186 conflicts out of 226 transactions. Was that your experience, that over 80% of transactions were conflicted with the board directors?
I never did the math, but there wasn't a single project review committee or board approval that didn't have at least 1 or 2 projects that were directly connected to board members. And for the majority of the time, employees weren't actually told about these conflicts. This was all only known at the board level, and you would only find out after the fact, and this is why I mentioned the additional help that was provided at these projects on the front end and the preferential treatment, because for the most part, none of this was known to us, but you can look back at it and say, oh, that was why they got preferential treatment relative to others.
Thank you. That is the time. Ms. Bradford, you have the floor for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you. Mic on now, if I hit the right button. Okay, I want to thank the witness for appearing today. I'm sure it's pretty uncomfortable for you. I understand that you already have given testimony at a previous committee, so I appreciate that you've come back because we asked you to come to public accounts. Can you outline the exact behaviors at fault here at SDTC, both from the mismanagement of funds front, but also behaviors inherent to the toxic workplace that are central to your claims?
As I mentioned, for the most part, there's a very structured and legitimate process that exists at SDTC to approve new funding. There's multiple employees that are involved, and there's multiple levels of due diligence that have to be completed that take, in the most part, almost 6 months to complete. The examples that I would mention are times where the project would come into SDTC and get selected for due diligence and a fast track, even though the company might have never applied in an official capacity. During the due diligence stages, multiple occasions, there were times where the external reviewers and the internal reviews that employees would do clearly pointed out that the project should not be funded, yet all of those decisions were then overruled by executives and then forced into the board for final approval.
Can I just ask for clarification? You said they never applied, but they came into. How did they come into for consideration if they weren't applying? I'm confused.
A lot of times these projects would just suddenly show up and an executive say, hey, we have this project that we think someone should look at. So again, there is a legitimate and official process, but some of these projects never followed that official capacity, and this is why I continue to mention the preferential treatment. So it's one thing to say everything is done and someone missed a conflict of interest declaration, but for all of these, if not the majority, it was always some extra case of there's preferential treatment, there is information that clearly shows that the project is ineligible under 5 or 6 different categories. And for any of those situations where at the same time they are continuing to push a project along that shouldn't, they are then rejecting other projects that have the same or better impacts to the environment that they would then reject in place of these projects.
Okay, so now then if you could turn your attention to the behaviors inherent to the toxic workplace that, are central to the claims that you brought forward.
I don't think that's the focus of this committee today, honestly.
I think it's up to us to decide what the focus of the committee is, and I'm asking the question respectfully because you were definitely claiming that it was a toxic workplace. And so I would like to know what behaviors constituted that in your opinion.
Well, for example, there were cases in which someone of LGBTQ background was abused by an executive employee.
Abused in what way? Like verbally abused or?
Verbally abused and accosted for what they were. And in other situations, for example, the CEO had 2 separate employees at the same time that were under her that were concurrently on stress leave. I don't think that's a normal situation for an organization with less than 50 people. Every single HR executive that worked at SDTC over a 2-year period went on stress leave and then was subsequently fired.
Could you tell us what period of time the two were on stress leave? Because, there has been a lot of stress in the workplace, and during COVID, people were short-staffed. So when approximately was this period where there were two off on stress leave at the same time?
I would ask SDTC.
Okay. All right. Now, what was the exact period of time that you were employed at SDTC? I think it's a span of about 2 years, but if you could provide us with more specific dates from the start and end of your employment there?
I worked there from, I believe, July 2020 all the way to June of 2022, during which time I was directly involved in the approvals and disbursements of over $200 million in funding, and that would include funding and reviews of projects across every single one of the different funding streams that the AG has mentioned in her report.
Okay, so I'm looking to understand if you served with the previous board chair, M. Basili, or was your term strictly under Ms. Venturin's chairmanship?
Just for Sharon.
Okay. So CBC reported last December that whistleblowers such as yourself had fears that when ICID took charge of the file, that the department would hesitate to get to the bottom of things because the target of the probe was funded and supervised by the department. But over the last year, ICID launched 2 independent investigative reviews through third parties and even welcomed an AG investigation in order to get to the bottom of claims at SDTC. So what were your fears based on exactly?
I hoped you listened to the recordings that were in those audio clips because I think they would provide some context. But, I mean, the whole SDTC situation is a conflict of interest, so why wouldn't ICID, who is implicated in its own mismanagement of SDTC, not conflicted in hiring a third party that supposedly is independent? But again, if they were actually independent, why would they have such long legal disclaimers that disclaim all responsibility against what their findings were? So if the minister claims that all of these were independent and truly factual, why do all of the actual reports say that none of this is actually factual or legally binding or even meet a minimum threshold of any sort of professional, legal, or accounting standards? When you compare that to the Auditor General, there was no disclaimer. There was nothing there that would say, hey, we don't know what we're talking about and this is not legally binding or this doesn't meet a requirement on the professional standards. I would also mention that there are over 37 hours of recordings that we are fully willing to provide that would clearly show how the situation actually evolved versus how the public would know.
Thank you. That is time, I'm afraid, Ms. Bradford. Suivant, c'est Madame Sinclair Degagné.
Madame Sinclair Degagné.
And witness 1, I'm just going to test the earpiece. On a maintenant.
So we have a system. It's changed somewhat. Can you hear me? Can you hear me in English? Witness 1, can you hear me in English? Is it working? Can you hear the interpreter? You can hear me? You can hear the interpreter?
Madame Sinclair Degagné.
Madame Sinclair Degagné, you have 6 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je tiens à remercier le témoin pour ses déclarations et son courage en étant avenant avec ses réponses avec nous aujourd'hui.
Now, gentlemen, I did ask you to check before we started. Everyone else did. Could you please, would you be able to help these gentlemen, please? So, as well.
This is the interpreter. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Mr. Brock, everything working? Mr. Barrett, Mr. Cooper, everyone? So we're speaking French, Mr. Barrett, now. You have 6 minutes from the top, Madame Sinclair Degagné. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to thank the witness for his courage, for being so frank in his testimony today. I'd like to reiterate, to start, that this entire catastrophe is really unfortunate. I think the current government has shown how to kill off a great idea, and I think that's exactly what they've done here with Sustainable Development Technology Canada, SDTC. And I'd like also to reiterate our support to the businesses that are victims of a really unfortunate situation in the case of a project that was, done with taxpayer money. Witness, just for our understanding, there was a lot said about conflicts of interest within the board. Also, there were some serious human resources problems that were raised within the organization in terms of the climate. Now, what I'd like to understand is, did you also notice conflicts of interest within the organization itself among employees, say a director who's not on the board, let's say an executive director? Did you notice that? And do you have any examples?
Several. One of the things I'd like to point out is the current COO, Ziad Rami, was actually implicated in the Auditor General's report because his wife was hired to actually recruit the board members, and he continues to work in that position today. So, there's a lot of people whose family members are benefiting, and think about the fact that his wife is hiring board members who then make decisions on his compensation. It's an obvious conflict.
Pardon, allez-y.
Another one that I think is more egregious
Go ahead.
approval of new funding would be the Alice Ecosystems project, which was a project that had a direct connection to the previous disgraced CEO, Leah Lawrence. For her situation, she had a best friend named Alden Donnelly, which she admitted to in the Ethics Committee meeting. For that specific project, she was going to be provided with hundreds of thousands of dollars as a subcontractor to a project which we have emails that prove that executives themselves said were not able to meet even the most minimum levels of financial compliance that are required by the government. And even when that was there, the CEO still pushed for that project to get approved, and even to this day, that project is still getting funding. On top of that, there are countless other, let's say a different ecosystem project, which might have, there's reviewers that you bring in for every project. There is a requirement for every project to have an external reviewer on the business and technical side. In several cases, these reviewers on one side would provide a project with a positive review, knowing that the project isn't technically sound, and within that same few months, a project that they themselves had an interest in would then be approved. So this isn't a board level issue. This is endemic across the organization at the higher level.
Parfait. Merci. Et vous avez nommé, par exemple...
Perfect. Thank you. You reiterated.
Il y avait la personne Leah Lawrence qui n'est pas...
You were referring to Leah Lawrence, who is no longer in office. Are there many other cases that you're aware of individuals who are in a conflict of interest, who have been identified, for instance, in some cases by the Auditor General, who are still working there, who will likely be at the NRC, or given the fact that the government said they would be keeping these positions?
From my understanding of the report or the letter that was given to the new board chair of SDTC, they've only stipulated that only non-executive employees would be getting contracts to NRC. So I don't know whether that's breaking news to the public, but from the sounds of it, it seems like either none of the executives are actually going to be moving on to NRC, which potentially creates a bigger issue because that might mean that they're going to get big payoffs for mismanaging the fund into the ground.
La dernière partie...
Last part. Perhaps I misunderstood, but could you repeat the last part about the fact that the executives will not be at the NRC, and what does that mean exactly?
Within the statement of work that the minister gave to the new board chair, the only stipulation that exists for SDTC employees getting contracts is for, it strictly says non-executive employees.
Exact. Et donc, qu'est-ce que ça implique?
Okay, and what does that involve?
A guarantee that only non-executive employees would be getting contracts at NRC.
Oui, d'accord. D'accord, parce que j'espérais que votre...
Okay, so my question is more to do with what will happen with those employees who are still working despite the conflict of interest, despite the identification of serious lapses by the Auditor General, and that's why I'm asking the question. If it's non-execs, then employees that are not executives will transfer, and do you think the problem might also be among these non-executive staffers, that, or are they really doing the best job they can, but the problem really is at the exec and board level?
I think it really is at the executive and board level. I think the non-executive people that maybe shouldn't be moving over to NRC are more related to the culture. You know, there's a lot of people who purposefully ignored the problems or also helped the situation for themselves, but you know, inevitably there might be some conflicts that I myself don't know of. So the only way that can truly be publicized is if the names of those people is actually public. And even for that situation, for an employee at SDTC, you actually did have a monthly report that you would put in to say that you had a conflict on anything, whether direct or indirect. And at the employee level, it was treated differently, where they actually did the work to ensure that no employee below that executive level had any, you know, sort of work or any impact on those types of projects. It might be a neighbor, or it might be an indirect person. Those were done pretty well, and I don't remember any situation of an employee who had a conflict that was actually conflated. So at worst, it might have been forgotten, but I don't believe that for employees themselves there's any significant cases.
Okay.
Et voilà, merci beaucoup. Suivant, up next.
There you have it.
You have the floor for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you very much to the witness for being both present and for your immense courage bringing forward what is a terrible instance of gross corruption, conflicts of interest, disgusting corporate culture, to be quite frank, and serious issues relative to the treatment of staff at SDTC. The issues that I think are pertinent for my beginning round were related to the instances of the conflict of interest that you've brought up. You've mentioned several times of the severe conflict of interest pertaining to executive members. I also appreciate your opening statement in regards to what is a very idealistic mission, and one that I think many Canadians agree on, which is to support innovation and technology towards the better development of green technology, something that you yourself have contributed to in Canada, so I don't want to diminish that work. But of course, it's come at the heels of taxpayers. It's come at the heels of the trust that Canadians should have in their institutions. And now it's incumbent upon the government and members of this committee to try to pick up the pieces of what has been a really devastating blow to public confidence in this type of work. So I want to thank you for mentioning those facts. I do want to see if you can describe to me one of the examples you mentioned in earlier testimony in response to one of my colleagues today, related to when an executive takes a project. Let's say it's one of their projects. The normal process you mentioned takes 6 months between the time when an original application is submitted by a regular person, not connected to the executive. 6 months go by and maybe they're approved. The executive, when they want to have a decision, when they want to get support for their project, how long does that approval time take?
It might be faster. I think, again, like with regards to executives, a lot of times it was someone that was friendly with the executives, and that's why I mentioned, you know, there is this inner circle of people that are above regular Canadians who are going through the regular process. When I talk about, you know, some of these fast-track processes and issues like that, for certain cases, let's say it's, because a lot of times it was an executive that was purposefully helping a company connected to a board member. And when it was a situation like that, even in cases where, let's say, the project was rejected to the point where it was unfeasible to even take it to the board, a lot of those projects were then sort of kept in the background, and at any point they were suddenly reactivated. Whereas if someone who had a real project was rejected, they were specifically told that it is rejected and here are all the requirements you need to come back to apply. For other projects connected to board members, it was never the case of that. It was sort of, okay, let's wait 6 months and then we can just move it along or try to pick it back up. So timing is one thing, but a lot of it was a little more like that, where all of the rules that existed were good to ensure that everything was done correctly, but everything that happened that I'm talking about is more on the obfuscation of rules, and there's all of these ways in which you can manipulate, but still pretend like you're meeting all of the requirements that exist. In other cases, when I'm talking about executives, there would be situations where an employee would write a specific finding or a specific recommendation that executives would actually change themselves. And they would then send that up to the board. So a lot of times, again, it's not that every person at the board level was corrupted. A lot of them were just, frankly, morons who didn't see what was happening.
To be frank, they're also complicit because they must have known about these things. They're members of a board. They would have been responsible ultimately for the decisions of the board, including instances where some board members were, of course, taking illicit contracts or finding ways to defer contracts to their buddies, correct? They're still implicated, correct?
Correct. And,
yeah.
You know, it's one thing to say, I forgot or I didn't notice, but when you agree to be a board member for STTC or any GIC appointed organization or anything within the federal government, you actually sign a fiduciary obligation to meet minimum requirements. And as much as everyone is still pretending like it was a mistake, we don't hold anyone accountable to that level when it's taxpayer dollars. And when we're talking about board members, you know, this is where it's a lot of mixed in situations where, yeah, executives would change things. Or let's say for a certain project, it was actually a not recommend from someone, which would effectively kill a project. Well, executives would supersede decisions or go to the actual external reviewers that were supposed to be independent and have them change their reviews. Or in certain situations, they would actually prevent the employee from speaking about the project at the board level, and they themselves would speak about it to make sure that they could tell the story that they wanted to tell.
So they'd be motivating these applications that were already reviewed under a regulatory process. They directly intervened in the decision-making and application process of their buddies to better leverage support for their friends' projects.
Across all stages of the process.
Across all stages of the process. Thank you very much for confirming that. My second point of this discussion is related to the actual work of employees. At the time, has there ever been, in your time there, you bore witness to or know of employees that were directed by executives to change or to manipulate aspects of an application that had already been denied?
Of course, all the time.
And what was the consequences for an employee who said no?
If an employee said no, it would be moved around to a different employee. So that's how the culture worked, right? There were obviously people brave enough to say no to certain things, and in a lot of those situations, executives would then move those projects to, let's say, an employee that was more agreeable to the executive. And how those employees benefited, well, they were the ones who got higher bonuses. They were the ones that would then get promotions. So this is where even at the executive level, or I would say employee level, you were benefiting from being more agreeable. And when I talk about, you know, the culture of fear, prior to myself being there, there was a major firing spree that effectively got rid of the majority of senior employees, especially as it relates to them who focus on financial compliance and all of these different key aspects that they were noting to be more and more problematic. So even prior to myself being there, there were already changes and things that effectively created an environment that would protect all of these issues, because anyone who would speak, they would know what was going to happen to them like others.
Sir, did you just say that environment already existed?
I'm afraid that is, we're well over. We'll come back to you. Mr. Barrett, you have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
So I'm going to ask you a set of questions. If you could be brief in your reply so we can get through them. You'll note the rounds of questioning are shorter now, sir. What funding streams violated the contribution agreement between Sustainable Development Technology Canada and the government?
All of them. The seed funding stream, the ecosystem funding stream, the startup funding stream, and the scale-up funding stream. I would mention that every single one of the seed funding projects did not meet any of the requirements, as did none of the ecosystem projects.
How much money passed through those streams?
I think it was over $50 million at least, but I think from the major findings, it has to be over $100 million.
Were many of the companies getting funding through these ineligible streams conflicted and connected to political appointees, Liberal appointed board members?
I would assume so. I think anyone who would be appointed through the GIC process would effectively be appointed by the Liberal Party.
Are you aware of any new contribution agreements being made since the Auditor General report came out?
There has been an updated contribution agreement which now effectively goes back and retroactively allows for the majority of those ineligible projects to be considered eligible.
So companies that were in conflicts before or ineligible, they've retroactively made them eligible?
Through the update to the contribution agreement, yes, they would be considered eligible.
That seems highly inappropriate, to say the least. Which of the Liberal-appointed board members benefited the most from what we know to be $330 million tax dollars given out in identified conflicts of interest?
I would say the one that was most benefiting was Andre Lise Mateau, because for her, like, she worked at Cycle Capital and she had multiple companies within the SDTC portfolio. So for her, it wasn't a simple one company situation like Annette Verscher. And for Andre Lise, you know, she was very friendly with the CEO at SDTC, and there were multiple instances where it wasn't just that she got preferential treatment for projects. She was getting funding 2 or 3 times where, you know, your project gets funding and it's technically graduated, and then it would come back into the fund and get an additional round of funding, and it might happen a 3rd time. So SDTC was effectively subsidizing companies for certain board members for years and years.
Has the board of SDTC met to approve more money being given out?
I believe that there has been a project review committee meeting with the new board which approved a new slate of projects to be funded this last week, I believe.
Are any of them conflicted?
I don't know.
So Trudeau's minister, Champagne, likes to exclaim quite loudly that he took action on the very moment that he heard about the problems at Sustainable Development Technology Canada. Is that true?
I would disagree with that.
Because the same conflicted companies then are still getting paid now. Is that right?
Exactly. You know, the findings that were the findings used to suspend SDTC were known to the federal government all the way back in May of 2023. There was a 5-month period during which the minister's office and PMO knew that there was a significant level of conflicts of interest and a significant issue on ineligible projects. And during those 5 months, they did nothing to stop. And even after they suspended SDTC, the projects that were noted to have broken conflicts and were ineligible were still given funding even after SDTC was suspended.
Right. So we've heard, and we understand it, I believe it to be true, that the quote-unquote new SDTC is the exact same as the old one. And, you know, I don't have any confidence that things have improved since the Auditor General's report. You know, the interim board is now effectively in charge of its own oversight. Should we be concerned about how many more millions are being doled out improperly in the coming 6 months?
Absolutely. I think the biggest risk I see with the situation is the fact that SDTC is going to hire their own consultants to review how they've fixed the situation. You know, I think they've mentioned hiring Deloitte to review how they've fixed the eligibility issues and conflicts. But again, I think we can all agree that none of the executives should have any say in what they've done and then have an ability to try and fix the situation. And Deloitte itself, you know, any of these consulting companies, if we're being serious here, you can pay them to say anything. So if they get paid enough by SDTC to say that, hey, everything is good, they will do it, just like Osler did for SDTC when their board investigated themselves and exonerated themselves in direct opposition to even the RCGT report.
Thank you very much. That is the time. Ms. Bradford, you have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to continue along my previous line of questioning where I was asking you to give some specific examples about the toxic workplace and the abuse and harassment of staff. So when you appeared at Indu Committee on December the 11th, 2023, you testified at length regarding this. You actually provided a package which included evidence of the toxic workplace culture that was created by the CEO, Leah Lawrence, and her friend and still current VP, Zoe Colbeck, who have been allowed to continue abusing and harassing employees by a passive senior management team and board that protect and hide the abuse. So I would like you to elaborate, as you did at that committee, so we have it on record here, exactly, you know, the abuse that you were talking about, harassment.
All right. Multiple instances of shouting at employees in public situations. Multiple instances of racist comments to employees, including myself, by Zoe Colbeck. There were instances at the board level where another executive who had a hijab was asked to take off her hijab. Like, again, how much do you really want me to list here?
Well, as much as you can easily recall, because this is important testimony for us to get on the record.
What else did they have? A bunch of employees who were put onto stress leave, not the ones I mentioned, but ones prior to that and after I had left SDTC. In a certain situation, there was I think they hired Mercer to change the salary levels, at which point the CEO and Zoe intervened to personally change the numbers to effectively give themselves and others a salary increase that was not what Mercer had provided. Again, like,
Okay,
I guess we can spend the 5 minutes thinking about all the abuses that happened.
Okay, so I want to ask you then, McCarthy Tetra was tasked with conducting a fact-finding review of alleged breaches of labor and employment practices and policies at SDTC. The allegations that you've brought forward today seemingly fit exactly with McCarthy's mandate. NDAs were waived, so the participants, both invited and voluntary, could speak freely about their past or current employer. Did you or anyone from the group of fellow whistleblowers participate in the review?
Oh, I participated. I found it to be useless. For example, if you read what the McCarthy Tetro disclaimer says, it says that none of the testimony is to actually be relied on from any of the employees. When employees within SDTC or outside were asking to have their NDAs removed, that actually went directly to the executives. So employees who are inside SDTC were actually named, and executives who should have who shouldn't have known that they were actually asking to speak were then actually, like, their identities were released by McCarthy. How do you expect anything truthful to happen when McCarthy effectively released the names of every current and former employee to the same executives that they are trying to, bring some transparency against? And at the same time, when I'm talking about certain aspects of what McCarthy did or didn't do, there were certain situations where McCarthy purposefully chose to not speak to employees because they said that you had to see their face. There were rules that McCarthy set where when employees who were worried about crying or worried about showing their face, even to McCarthy's lawyers, McCarthy said that they would not interview them or take any of their testimony, because how McCarthy described the process was, we are only willing to do this and we will judge the actual, they're judging whether someone is truthful or not.
Of my time. They reviewed over 3,000 pages of documentation and spoke with over 62 interviewees, with almost an equal amount of former versus current employees. The review lasted 6 months. I'd like to pick out 2 conclusions of the review. On harassment, it found that, quote, current or former executives did not engage in the type of repetitive vexations or major incident conduct that would constitute harassment, bullying, or workplace violence under applicable standards, unquote. And that, quote, the notion of a toxic workplace was a minority view among the participants, unquote. It also found that, quote, decisions about restructuring or terminations...
Ms. Bradford, I don't want to cut you off. You are at your limit. If you want to ask a question, go ahead. But
Can I just finish the sentence and then I'm done?
How long is it?
It's maybe 30 words.
Go ahead.
It also found that decisions about restructuring or terminations were not made using discriminatory criteria, nor were they arbitrary and lacking reasonable business justification. So I'm having a hard time squaring your testimony with the conclusions of the review.
I would.
Witness one, I'm going to come back for an answer. I'm sure you'll get an opportunity. Suivant, c'est Madame Sinclair-Desgagnés. Vous avez la parole pour 2 minutes 30.
2.5 minutes, Madame Sinclair-Desgagnés. You have the floor. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just for context, witness one, what were your exact dates of employment at this organization, SDTC?
July 2020 to June 2022. So
Okay.
2 years, basically.
OK.
Okay, great. I'm just trying to understand. When SDTC was disbanded in June, usually you'd have all funding or any kind of funding for the enterprise would have been stopped at that point. How do you know that funds are still being dispersed to various businesses that would not have been eligible for them?
Are you speaking about the funding being canceled today in this June or when they were suspended in October?
Ben, il y en a qui ont été arrêtés en octobre.
Some in October, so that's been a year, yes. But I believe I've understood in the answers you gave to my colleagues' questions that you were saying there was still money that was being sent to these businesses through SDTC. Is that the case? Or am I correct in thinking that based on the information I have, it's all been stopped?
So between the time SDTC was suspended in October, they still allowed disbursement. So you weren't allowed to approve new projects, but the projects that were already approved continue getting funding up until, I think, February or March of this year. With regards to new funding, what's happened now is since the minister has dissolved SDTC, they've been told that disbursements can start, but disbursements haven't actually started. But new projects approvals have now started. So again, it's a mix of certain things happening at the same time.
Okay.
Vous donner des
Okay. So can you give us any evidence to that? I mean, how do you know this? Is it through the contacts you still have at SDTC, or is it with new businesses, or how do you know this? I'm just trying to understand how.
Employees
Donc,
at SDTC all the time. So
donc
this
c'est eux
is all
qui vous
information.
So they're the ones that told you?
OK, donc c'est de l'information.
So this is information from current employees at SDTC. Okay, great. A brief question, Mr. Chair, I would imagine I have. Very brief. I have information according to which, okay, you're saying that these new projects have funding, but those older projects, it stopped in October. Even projects that were already approved, that had been approved, have stopped receiving funding. So is there favoritism here? Those that have already been pre-approved and are legitimate no longer have funding versus others who have continued because the project was approved, they are still continuing.
Yeah.
Witness one, a brief answer, and Madame Sinclair-Desgagnés will come back to you if she needs to, but a brief answer, please.
There was a gray area between the suspension where certain projects were approved by the board, and then that was informed to the companies, but the suspension basically stopped them from contracting and actually getting any of the funding.
Thank you very much. Suivant, it's Mr. Desjardins. You have the floor for 2.5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I do now want to just make 2 comments. One comment on the fact that you've been asked by this committee in regards to HR. You've given some examples. Those examples have also been mentioned in the Indu committee. I appreciate you returning to that topic. I do want to give you an opportunity for maybe 15 seconds, because my time is limited, to just respond to my Liberal colleague's claim that there is or is not or at least attempting, to my perspective, to diminish what is a real instance of workplace abuse and harassment. So could you please spend 15 seconds to 20 seconds? I'll offer you that to explain or clarify.
I'd ask the the committee member to give me an example where an organization has an amazing culture but then gets shut down.
Thank you very much for that. Now, moving to my next portion of my questioning is the timeline. And so in the timeline you've given in your opening remarks, you mentioned this has been a 2-year and ongoing pursuit of yours to get justice for Canadian taxpayers. You mentioned an instance where you had brought this up with a Liberal MP. Could you please describe in very specific detail the nature of that? Was it written? Was it a meeting? Was this something that happened in person? Was it virtual? Was it you, or was it a representative of his office?
I can show you my texts. Like, I met George Chahal face to face, and I have text messages proving that this, encounter happened. And what I find embarrassing about that whole situation is that when SDTC was suspended in October, which would be almost 18 months after I spoken to him, his chief of staff tried to convince me that it was George Chahal that had actually reported the situation to ISET. So I think there's a big situation here where either George Chahal, an MP that I actually voted for, lied to me, or he's lying to the public, because did he actually forward my situation to ISET, and was it ISET that ignored it, or is he just lying to save face?
I understand. And then the second course of action you took was largely in pursuit of, within your pursuit for this justice, you did attend, or did you attend any meeting with members of the PCO?
Oh yeah, I did.
And during those encounters, how did they respond to your original claim?
I think they took it seriously, but I would mention that every single decision that was made at ISET had PCO involvement from day one, because members of SDTC's board were appointed by the Privy Council, and that was stated to us across basically like 7 or 8 meetings, where anytime there was a decision or finding within ISET, the bureaucrats were not able to move unless they spoke to both the minister's office and the prime minister's office before the decisions were made. And in every instance of that situation, nothing ever moved forward.
Interesting.
Thank you. That is your time, I'm afraid, Mr.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Just a note to some of the observers. There have been a couple just complaints have come in, or concerns to me independently, just about noise in the background. So I could just ask everyone, if you have conversations, if you could take them outside of the room, please, I would appreciate it. So this I appreciate that. And I'll turn now to Mr. Brock for 5 minutes, please. You have the floor.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, witness, for your attendance today. Thank you for your courage and bravery in coming forward and exposing the systemic corruption with this failed Liberal government. Canadians, thank you. I personally thank you. Now, I want to start by focusing in on lies. You referenced George Chahal, either lying directly to you or lying to Canadians, Liberal MP from Calgary. You've also made claims that Minister Champagne has deliberately misled, or in your words, lied to Canadians and lied to committee. You referenced in a recent post that there was an egregious cover-up over allegations of mismanagement and misconduct by SDTC. In essence, your position is that the minister and his office softened the final report of an investigation into governance and conflicts of interest at SDTC in essence, to protect Justin Trudeau's hand-picked conflicted chair, Annette Verschuren. So I take it that you're referencing 2 avenues of deliberate deceit by Minister Champagne. One in relation to the report when it was received, and your allegation, sir, that it was manipulated, or in your words, softened, and actually the timing by which he shared the news with Canadians that he took action. Am I accurate in that assessment?
You're accurate. And I would, I'd mentioned that there's a lot of public interest in this current parliamentary session with the potential of a vote of no confidence. And I would say that the real vote of no confidence against the Liberal Party happened when the Auditor General made a decision to intervene, because the Auditor General was the one that actually referenced the situation to PCO, and I said because the AG's office thought that this was a very simple situation to address.
Sure.
And when the ISED minister decided to not act, that is when the AG's office intervened. That in itself is a bigger vote of no confidence against the government than anything else.
Sure. And Minister Champagne has proudly on numerous occasions talked about how efficiently he acted, displaying transparency and accountability to Canadians. You're claiming the complete opposite, that he took the report, manipulated the report, softened the language, and then delayed doing anything to protect the insiders that were currently governing SDTC. Is that correct?
Well, yeah, it's correct. It's any ruling party would not want this on their plate, so there's an obvious reason for why nothing happened.
Okay, so I'll stop you right there. With respect to the 37 hours of recordings with the Assistant Deputy Minister, correct me if I'm wrong, the chain of command with respect to communication at that level, the Assistant Deputy Minister reports to the Deputy Minister of ISED, who then reports to Minister Champagne. Is that correct?
Correct.
And you shared months and months of concerns, 300 pages of concerns laid out regarding allegations of mismanagement and human resource issues. You shared that. You shared that with the ADM, and I'm now telling you that likely the ADM most assuredly transferred that knowledge to the Deputy Minister, who transferred that knowledge to Minister Champagne, and no one did anything. Until the fall of 2023. Is that accurate?
That's accurate.
Okay. Thank you. No further questions.
Thank you.
My apologies. I do. My apologies, Chair. I have 30 seconds.
You have 30 seconds.
Would you table, sir, you referenced the 37 hours of transcripts of the ISED conversations with the ADM. Will you table those transcripts with this committee, please?
Sure.
Thank you. Those are the questions.
Thank you very much. Ms. Yip, you have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you to the witness for bravely coming forward. I'd like to go back to some of Mr. Brock's references here about implying that the minister manipulated the ruse or slowed down the findings and so forth. What evidence is there that he did that, the minister?
Multiple recordings that provide evidence that the ADM and the Deputy Minister had actually given the Minister and the Minister's office updates as to what was happening at SDTC and the findings, whereas the Minister himself has publicly stated that he had no idea what was going on between March and the end of September. On top of that, there's even audio evidence that at the end of the reporting period, at which point the final recommendation was made to the Minister, their reports and information were actually given to the Minister verbally, at which point he asked for changes to the report and recommendations before it was officially registered. So
there's concrete proof?
I said audio clips.
I'd like to go back to following up Ms. Bradford's comment about how she had a hard time squaring your testimony with the conclusions of the McCarthy review. There are clear conclusions, 62 interviews with 3,000 pages of documents that differ from your view. How can you explain this discrepancy?
As I mentioned before, I would ask for you to give me an example of an organization that gets shut down that had a good culture, but I would also, again, mention other aspects of the McCarthy Review. At a certain point, they only had negative testimony, at which point they went out of their way to ask other employees to testify for this report. I don't think that's a regular occurrence where the lawyers are going to other employees to ask for testimony in the positive side. I would also mention again, like what other aspect, if the McCarthy Tetra report is actually true, why don't they release the report instead of 7 slides with random statements? If they truly say that they've looked into these situations, why is there no public proof that they did? And why is there no public proof that they have actual evidence that go against these statements? Just because a lawyer or a law firm says that these statements are incorrect, if they're not providing evidence, how are you attacking me saying that the culture is good when the evidence isn't actually there?
Did the other 20 whistleblowers also participate in the review?
I would assume so, but a lot of them, as I said, weren't even interviewed. But I know for a fact that the ones that needed to be interviewed were interviewed. So, again, maybe I'll ask this for the minister. Why doesn't he actually get rid of everyone's NDA and everyone can hear the stories themselves? Because as of right now, the NDAs are off. So if you are so obsessed with disproving my claim, take off everyone's NDAs and let the public find out exactly what happened.
The review noted that, quote, while participants used terminology such as harassment and bullying to describe executive treatment of employees in the workplace, that was in the minority, and the few examples that were offered as evidence revealed more of a discomfort with the direct style of leadership and or disagreement with decisions made by leadership than actual harassment or bullying. They have found no examples of executives yelling or swearing, verbally abusing, or physically threatening employees, end quote. So how should we square that with your testimony?
As I said, release the transcript that exists for all of these interviews. They took notes. If McCarthy Tetra is saying they did all of this and they have evidence to be contrary to what everyone says, I would happily accept their findings if they actually release anything substantive.
How much time?
Very brief, about 8 seconds.
Okay, well, I'll let it.
Thank you very much. Beginning our third round, it is my intention to get through a third and fourth round. Mr. Cooper, you have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. You stated in your testimony that the minister lied when he said he was first briefed about the RCGT fact-finding report. At committee, the minister was very clear that he first learned about wrongdoing, conflicts, and mismanagement at SDTC. But that would not be correct, would it?
Probably not. Again, what did George Chahal say to him? You have to ask him.
You referenced that there was an interim RCGT report that contained many of the findings that ultimately made its way into the RCGT report that was issued in October. The interim report was written in May, and that the department was going to undertake or establish a directorate to undertake a series of investigations. I presume the minister would have been briefed in or around May about that interim RCGT report. Is that correct?
Correct. And the recordings showed that the deputy minister and the ADM had plans to speak to the minister around the findings, at which point the following week everything suddenly changed and now they needed more time and expansion of timing. I would say I myself was personally given the full verbal debrief by RCGT over a 2-hour period on exactly what the findings were at that point. So again, I think I maybe want to mention that the 37 hours that I'm talking about, this isn't, they integrated me into every aspect of the investigation. I don't know why, but they did.
No. Okay.
So the information I'm providing,
Okay.
I'm factually telling the truth
Well,
because it's
well,
all
thank
validated.
you, thank you. Because the minister never mentioned anything about an interim report. He never mentioned anything about being briefed in May or June. He led a parliamentary committee to believe that he first learned about the findings of wrongdoing in September, and you said a year ago, or nearly a year ago, that he lied. And I presume it was in that context, but you said he lied. Is that correct?
At that part and the part about the fact that he said he had no no say in that final recommendation. But again, there's evidence to the contrary showing that before he was actually given the recommendation, him and his office had actual verbal conversations with the ADM and the Deputy Minister to ask for changes on those reports and the recommendation prior to its official submission. And I would also say that the most indicative aspect of the situation that I said and the cover-up is the fact that the Deputy Minister is actually retiring.
So, in short, the minister was in the thick of it. He was actively involved. He was learning about information around wrongdoing. He was being briefed, and he was actively, along with his deputy minister, involved in saying, we want to change this, we want to change that, we want to soften the report throughout until it was released in October. Is that a fair characterization of what happened?
That's fair, and it's not just the minister, it's PCO and the Department of Justice, because again, there were implications immediately when the investigation started in March because these were PCO appointees.
Who in PCO and Justice was involved in this corrupt editing process along with the minister?
ADMs.
ADM Noseworthy?
No, he wasn't involved in any investigation because he was implicated. What I meant was ADMs and people of that level as counterparts to the people at ISED were involved from day one.
Would it be fair to characterize that the conduct of the minister was corrupt?
Yeah. I mean, embarrassing at minimum.
Deceitful?
Yeah.
You also said last year and today that there was a consensus amongst bureaucrats at ISED that the board needed to go. But that changed when the minister intervened. Why did Minister Champagne go against the advice of his officials and politically interfere to keep the SDTC board, the conflicted board that had doled out hundreds of millions of dollars improperly, to keep that board in place? Why?
Because I think that the current government is more interested in protecting themselves and protecting the situation being a public nightmare, and they would rather protect wrongdoers and financial mismanagement than have to deal with a situation like SDDC in the public sphere.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cooper. Mr. Weiler, you're up for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair, and I do want to thank our witness for coming to our committee today to speak on this very serious matter. My first question is, did you provide your 300-page documents over to the Auditor General when you first reached out to her office last year?
Yep, I did. Okay. Sorry, not last year. It was December of 2022.
Thank you for that. And have you or any of the other whistleblowers spoken to the AG's office since your last appearance in Parliament in December of last year? And did you provide her office with any complaints and supporting documents?
Yeah, we gave them all the recordings to validate the situation. So they had the recordings and all the documents they requested.
Thank you. Do you believe there was criminal wrongdoing at SDTC? And I ask, as parliamentarians have looked to push the RCMP to open a criminal investigation into the allegations, and the OAG has the authority to refer evidence of criminality to the RCMP. And as of late July, the RCMP confirmed the Auditor General has not referred any evidence to the RCMP, leading us to consider that there may be no evidence of criminal wrongdoing. But I'd be curious if you would care to comment on this.
I think the Auditor General's investigation was more of a cursory review. I don't think the goal and mandate of the Auditor General's office to actually look into criminality, so I'm not surprised by the fact that they haven't found anything criminal because they're not looking at intent. So if their investigation was focused on intent, of course they would find the criminality, but they were just focused on the facts of what happened, and what they're just pointing out is here was the financial mismanagement, here are all the rules that weren't followed, and the only, I know the federal government, like the minister, has continued saying that there was no criminal intent and nothing was found, but I think the committee would agree that they're not to be trusted on the situation. I would happily agree to whatever the findings are by the RCMP, but I would say that I wouldn't trust that there isn't any criminality unless the RCMP is given full authority to investigate, because unlike the Auditor General and the sorts of requirements they have for an investigation, the McCarthy Tetro, the RCGT, was not legally binding. It wasn't obligating SDTC, the board members, or anyone else to actually provide some sort of, consent or waiver that obligates them to tell the truth. So again, if you bring in the RCMP and they do their investigation and they find something or they don't, I think the public would be happy with that, but I don't think we should leave it to the current federal government or the ruling party to make those decisions, because let the public see what's there.
And do you believe that the RCMP doesn't have authority to investigate in this matter?
No, I definitely believe they have authority.
The RCMP commissioner also stated in their letter from July 25th that after careful review of available evidence, like the OAG's report on SDTC, along with reports by ISED and any public available information, they did not identify any criminal offenses or evidence of criminal wrongdoing at that time in relation to any specific individual organization related to the SDTC matter. Would you care to comment on this?
I think all the information the RCMP has received from ISED or the AG, again, the question to them is, were any of them looking for criminal intent? Right? So it's one thing to say no criminal intent was found, but the question to ask the AG or anyone else is, were they looking for criminal intent or were they not? Because if you look at the scope of the RCGT report or the Auditor General's report, that was not in their scope or mandate. So that doesn't reconcile with the secondary, because unless someone was actually looking for that and nothing was found, okay, sure, but that hasn't happened yet. So it's one thing to say nothing has been found as of yet, but that obfuscates from the fact that nothing has been looked into for that matter.
You've got about 5 seconds. Thank you very much.
I'll get that to my next round.
Fair enough, yes. Suivant, c'est Madame Stickler-Desgagnés pour 2 minutes 30 secondes.
You have 2.5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't have much time, so I'd like some brief answers. To remind the public and parliamentarians here, the Raymond Chabot Grant Thornton report, RCGT, was shared with ISED. When was that?
The draft report would have been shared with ISED sometime in May, if not June.
De cette année.
This year? This year?
Sorry, of last year.
C'est ça, mai-juin de l'année dernière. Parfait.
Okay, last year, okay. You referred to evidence that there were discussions between Minister Champagne, his staff, some executives at SDTC regarding very serious issues. What evidence do you have? You mentioned there is evidence, but what is it?
It was the recordings, and I would maybe request that I'd be fully willing to have an in-camera session to have all of the key recordings be played for everyone in the committee for them to make their own decisions about the situation.
D'accord. Vous êtes en possession?
Okay, you're in possession of these recordings?
Correct.
D'accord, parfait.
Okay. Do you also have the CGT report, or did you only see it?
I received a full verbal debrief, but it was basically read to me verbatim.
Okay. Donc, vous l'avez pas papier.
Okay, so you don't have a paper copy of it, because I would have liked for you to share it with the committee, that report. Because unfortunately, it was shared with another committee, but heavily redacted. So that our CGT report, it was heavily redacted. So parliamentarians actually were hampered in this way. I'd like for you to share it with us, because I think this is information that would be quite relevant. I have so many questions. I think I could go off in another vein, but one brief question, because I don't have much time. Do you believe, nevertheless, that there are projects in these among the projects that were there that were eligible? You've given a very dark picture of the situation, and I understand that's your testimony, that's your experience, but there are some businesses here that deserve these funds, met the criteria, and really should have continued to receive these funds from an organization that would have been better managed than SDTC.
That's correct. And my previous testimony at the industry committee stated that I think that like 90% or maybe the majority of the projects should have received funding and are eligible across all categories. It's only a small majority that's connected to a small group of people.
Et voilà, merci beaucoup.
Merci.
Merci beaucoup.
That's all the time. Thank you.
Mr. Dejla, you have the floor for 2.5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I want to turn to a piece of evidence that was suggested in the Auditor General's report. 6.74, an Assistant Deputy Minister of the Department regularly attended meetings of the Foundation's board and received all board materials, but neither the Department nor the Foundation documented what they expected from this role. We found that the Director's understanding of the Assistant Deputy Minister's role did not align with his own. This ambiguity led the board to believe that the Assistant Deputy Minister's presence at meetings provided an implicit agreement by the Department for any decisions that the government made. Are you aware of which Deputy Minister that is?
That's now retired ADM Andrew Noseworthy.
And how much or how often, in your understanding of the situation, was Mr. Noseworthy privy to information related to either the HR issues or the decisions that led to conflicts of interest?
I don't know which report it said, but it's in one of the reports, it specifically states that none of the HR issues were ever reported at the board level. So even when they did exist, the board would never be privy to them. And that's a finding from, I think, either the AG or RCGT.
And so with that knowledge, and I'll just accept that to be true in this for the purpose of this questioning, is it likely that the ADM did not know or was unaware of the HR issues because of that breakdown of HR systems within the organization?
Correct. I don't believe the board was privy to most of these situations, but I would say that Andrew Noseworthy himself was a conflicted party at SDTC because he has a friendly relationship with Annette Verschaeren, and some of that funding that was given to the Verschaeren Center to ACOA was through the support of Andrew Noseworthy, who himself was acting at a professional capacity at ACOA. So there's, again, even the ISED representative was a bit too friendly with everyone at the top. So whether there were issues there or not that he could have, maybe noted, he probably wasn't the right person to be there because of his other issues at that point.
So the Assistant Deputy Minister not only didn't understand his role within the organization or why he was attending these board meetings, as according to the Auditor General, you're going a step further and suggesting that perhaps he had an interest in participating in those boards, correct?
I think maybe one of the things I should mention is correct, is that ISED actually completed a report that gave a glowing review of SDTC in, I believe, early 2023 that was then shelved and never published. So there is an ISED review of SDTC that, again, I think maybe proves how little they actually understood about the organization and how obfuscated all of the situation was, because for them, maybe it's the fact that no one expects an organization that's giving out free money to have these types of issues, but maybe that's why it happened that way.
Thank you very
So
much.
corrupt board and a
afraid,
corrupt
I'm
ADM.
afraid that is your time, but you will have one last opportunity, Mr. Desjardins. Mr. Perkins, you have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Earlier, you mentioned the Mercer report on compensation and that it was altered. Do you have, if you have copies of both of those, can you table those?
I don't have copies, but I can provide, again, people have to be taken out of their NDAs to provide evidence of that happening, but there are executives and other employees
okay, I'll ask the committee if the committee with consent will ask for the tabling of those documents with the committee, please. Thank you. Mr. Chair, the Mercer, the unredacted Mercer report, the pre and post-edited Mercer reports that the witness referred to.
SDTC.
Sorry, I've just stopped the clock. Mr. Perkins, what are you asking for?
I'm asking if the committee will request the production from SDTC or PCO, whoever the appropriate body is,
He has those
of the
reports.
Mercer compensation reports that the witness said were altered.
All right. Is there any disagreement on that? There is none. Thank you very much, Mr. Perkins. You have 4 minutes, 20 seconds.
Thank you. You mentioned the meetings. ADM Noseworthy was in all the meetings where the investments were decided. Now, the Auditor General found 82% of her selection were conflicted. My understanding is that those meetings started off with the recitation of which directors were conflicted with which project. Is that correct?
Correct.
So they briefed all the board members or all the investment committee members about which director was conflicted with which before they said, now we're going to vote on Jake's project. So they all knew whose project it was. Awfully convenient. Maybe that's how 82% got.
So I would also mention that, when the ex-chair was at committee, I think on Monday, she mentioned that, irregardless of the lack of recusals, there was a full and thorough review done by the board members on every single project, which is also a lie because at that point in time, SDTC was doing bulk approvals of projects. So you would present maybe 4 or 5 projects to the committee. The rest of the 7 or 10 projects would get approved automatically as long as no one had a question about it. So the board and the project review committee that, again, had the fiduciary obligation to approve it, they would not actually even review the projects that in many cases were conflicted by board members.
Okay, so Ms. Visharan claimed, was there anything else in her testimony that you thought was not truthful to the committee?
I think another thing to mention is when we're talking about the COVID payments that existed, one of the things that continues to not be described is the context of what happened because board members had actually agreed to not provide a second COVID payment in October of 2020.
Okay, well, we're going to come to the COVID payments if we could, because I have short time and a couple of other questions. Other directors, you mentioned Andre-Lise Matot, who was a beneficiary of this. She actually left the SDTC board and went to the Infrastructure Bank board. The Liberals appointed her there, and then she was part of the team that approved $170 million for the chair of the SDTC board's project. But when I go through some of these things, it's sort of, while her time was on the board, are you aware of Enekerm, Alberta, Biofuels, MindSense, Spark Microsystems, Concentric Agriculture, Polystyrevarant? There's about 20 or 30 companies here that Ms. Matot had financial interest in through Cycle Capital. While she was on the board, they received $114 million, it seems, by my calculations. So was this part of the problem that's going on? You get, as Andre-Lise Matot got $117 million, and she goes to the Infrastructure Bank and helps out her friend who got her this?
Correct. I think the board members and a lot of public, there's this excuse that continues to be perpetuated that this is a small industry and we cannot find anyone else within this small industry that has this technical expertise to approve projects. That's a false narrative. There are thousands of people. Canada's a huge country. they had the right people. They could find the right people to not have conflicts, but that didn't happen. They purposefully allowed.
There's no way
all
these
people with
few
conflicts.
board members represented 82% of the green technology industry in Canada.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And again, the issue is they are at the front of the line, not just at SDTC, at all these other organizations, BDC, EDC, the Infrastructure Bank. They are friendly with everyone there, and their companies get money from SDTC. Then they go to the next organization using the approvals and due diligence from SDTC, and they continue going, and it's this perpetual cycle where it's funding from Crown Corporation's government that continue.
So do you think the Auditor General only did 228 of over 400 transactions in the audit period and identified 390 million of 800 million that was inappropriately allocated to directors' conflicts of interest and outside the con? Do you think the rest of those transactions, the other 200 or so, represent the same amount? So could we possibly be dealing with about 700 million, maybe 800 million almost, of money that was conflicted?
Thank you, Mr. Perkins. I'll allow the witness to answer.
I don't think so. Again, I would have to look at the projects and to see what that looks like.
Thank you very much. Ms. Shipp, you have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. Fellow whistleblowers have stated in an interview on November 1st, 2023, when the independent review had yet to start, that your group remained, quote, unconvinced that the human resource investigation would have the necessary autonomy and authority to get to the bottom of things, quote, end quote. The independent review was not only led by a third-party law firm, but it was also publicly announced that all former STDC employees would not be bound by NDAs, so they may speak freely about issues related to their employment at SDTC. Can you elaborate on why this was your view?
Can you explain the question again? I missed it.
Okay, yeah, I'm sorry about the noise. If everyone could just keep down, the witness is not able to hear the question. And we have a new chair. Okay, so sorry about that, Mr. Witness. I'll start again. Fellow whistleblowers stated in an interview on November 1st, 2023, when the independent review had yet to start, that your group remained, quote, unconvinced that the human resource investigation would have the necessary autonomy and authority to get to the bottom of things, end quote. The independent review was not only led by a third-party law firm, but it was also publicly announced that all former STDC employees would not be bound by NDAs, so they may speak freely about issues related to their employment at SDTC. Can you elaborate on why this was your view?
Well, I mean, RCGT was also hired by ISED, and that was a clear disaster, so why would we expect McCarthy Tetro to do anything differently? I can't speak for the whistleblower you're talking about in that specific article because, again, it's not a single person, but I would again mention that if you truly believe that this statement that you're mentioning and this defensive action is true, please release everyone from their NDAs so they can all speak about this. If you are actually truly interested in the abuses that happened, talk to your minister and ask him to release everyone from the NDAs. He has the ability to do that because he has now actually appointed board members that are all from the federal government. So he can, in one fell swoop, actually release everyone from the NDAs, and we can listen to everyone's testimony, and we can look at every single thing that McCarthy Tetro says is true and not true. But I don't find this back and forth productive because, again, how am I supposed to stand up and provide examples when myself doing that might implicate someone in the NDAs that they have? Like, I think it's a bad line of questioning that you keep on focusing on because, again, if you truly cared about the situation, you would maybe get the NDAs off of everyone instead of talking about how great of a job McCarthy Tetro did.
Well, with all due respect, you're here to answer our questions.
And I think I did answer the question.
So I'd like to go back to your opening statement. You mentioned about you still feel that real accountability still does not exist.
Correct.
Would you like to elaborate on that, why you still, in this current time, feel that it's not?
Well, why doesn't the government release all the documents to the RCMP? Again, if they don't think there's a problem, release the documents to the RCMP. I'm not asking for the public. It's, again, there's all of this lack of publicity. The minister didn't even release the RCGT report to the public, and he wasn't even willing to release it to the committee. And I think it's embarrassing that when we're talking about the ethics committee and what happened there, I myself personally got involved with politicians from all sides and gave them the report because I had the RCGT report before the members of parliament did. And when you have to go to those extremes, I think it's embarrassing. So again, this question around why I don't trust the government, it's like, does anyone trust the government?
So as STTC programming is fully transitioning into the National Research Council, what are your recommendations to the government at this point in time?
Fire the useless executives and senior management that's been implicated.
Thank you very much. There'll be another chance to continue that. Beginning our fourth and final round, of which there'll be 6 slots for 6 members with various times. Mr. Stewart, you have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you. Thank you for being here today. To the whistleblower. One of the things I'd like to ask for through the chair is that if you would, for the production of documents for the unredacted interim RCGT report and the unredacted final RCGT report. Is that something that we can get here?
Through the witness.
It's through the witness.
I think that's through the witness.
Through the witness,
If
yeah.
the witness is
I
able
don't have
to
the
table it.
unredacted reports. I have them I have one that's partially less redacted than what was given to the committee, so I can provide that. But the only thing I can provide for that interim report is the audio recordings and the transcript, which again, verbatim is the partner at...
We appreciate that. There was another thing as well before I get into this. We were also looking for in addition to the recordings, there's still an interest here to get copies of the historic contribution agreements, as well as the updated, I understand there's some policy changes, and there's an updated contribution agreement. Are you able to provide both of those agreements as well?
I think so. I think maybe I don't know if I have the most ratified one for the most updated, but I can provide contribution agreements 6, 7, 8, and 9, the ones that would be relevant to the time period that we're talking about.
Can the committee produce that in the production of documents? The most recent ones? I
think you'd have to ask ISET or the SDTC to provide the most recent one.
Okay. Okay, just, has anybody been fired in the bureaucracy after everything that's been discussed here? Has anybody been fired?
I think there's been a lot of convenient retirements.
That's an interesting way of putting it. You know, this is really, I heard my colleague from South Shore St. Margaret's call it a culture of corruption. It's actually next level corruption with adrenaline shots and then steroids to follow that. This is the worst scandal I've seen in my time here. One of the questions I have is with the contribution agreements, provincially I was a minister, if we wanted to spend outside the threshold, I know this is different, but we would have to go to the Executive Council and then we could maybe spend more if that was something that the government was going to do. Doesn't Parliament have to approve spending outside of what the contribution agreements lay out?
I think with regards to maybe some of those payments or things, SDTC was always below the targeted spending that gave the executives their bonuses. So a lot of these approvals were made to offset what was still available to them under the contribution agreement. So let's say you had a target to spend, because again, the incentive structures at SDTC were based on how much money you spent and how fast you sent it out, not how effectively you used it. And in certain cases, when you didn't meet that target threshold that you needed, you would then provide some level of, automated funding or something like these COVID payments to meet the amount that you were technically available to give out.
But $58 million was spent by the board outside of the contribution agreements, which to me seems like illegal behavior by the board. But I would assume that only Parliament could approve spending estimates. That's where I was curious on that.
Potentially. I'm not a lawyer.
Yeah, me neither. So next question. The minister claims the department became aware of mismanaged conflict at the start of the year in 2023, but it's potentially apparent that the minister could have become aware as early as May 2022 based on audio recordings. In your assessment, how likely is it that the minister was more than aware much before early of 2023?
I think it's unlikely. I think George Chahal's just lying, honestly. But I would assume, from some of the conversations I had within that ISET investigation, there were indications that there had been other problems previously reported to ISET as it pertains to SDTC or its executives or board. So there is the possibility that there was something that was potentially known to ISET prior to this situation, but maybe nothing as specific to the situation that we're talking about right now.
So essentially what you're saying, though, is the ADM who was privy to all of it, I don't remember the individual's surname at this moment, but that ADM would have had to brief the deputy minister, and it's the deputy minister's responsibility to brief the minister. That's a lot of time going by. It seems very unlikely that the minister wasn't aware.
Correct.
Do you believe he was aware? Outside of George Chahal, just what do you believe? Do you believe the minister was aware that this was all going on?
I believe that during the time at which that March 2023 to October, he was aware of the situation the whole time. He was not just given an awareness at March and then he conveniently forgot about the situation for 8 months up until the point, because again, within the context of the conversation that occurred, one of the things that was continuously explained to myself was the fact that there was always this political pressure on the ADM and the deputy minister to give updates and provide, some sort of an end of this investigation. So the only reason that would happen is if there was a continuous conversation back and forth about the situation.
Thank you very much. That is the time. Mr. Wiley, you have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. Just give the witness a second to have a sip of water. I do just want to pick up on the question that my colleague Ms. Yip asked earlier. As the transition is happening from SDTC to the NRC, what recommendations do you have for the programming as this is taking place?
Again, I don't know, recommendations as it pertains to the people there or recommendations to the funding. I think if they truly want to have any aspect of this survive and protect the companies that legitimately receive the funding, I think the government needs to do a better job to provide public confidence that they're actually addressing the issues, because my fear is that they're going to continue on the pathway that they've been in, and they're going to continue to hide certain aspects of the situation. And once it moves over to NRC, there's a higher risk that something comes out and that would then permanently impact a federal department. I think that one of the reasons why this transition is going to take a long time is that with all of this wrongdoing and misconduct that's already been founded, that is going to impact companies. I know that there's been companies that have potentially maybe gone bankrupt because of this situation. That is a huge legal liability that SDTC executives have created for the federal government. So, as a taxpayer, they should deal with that situation before it's brought into the federal government itself. And I think the idea that they're bringing in SDTC to NRC and then spinning it back out doesn't seem like a logical situation, because that kind of seems abusive to employees, where you are winding down an organization, setting it up on the inside, and then spinning it back out over a 3-year period. It kind of sounds like purgatory or something.
Mm-hmm. Well, that actually leads into my next question, and I appreciate your answer. So how can we ensure that with this overhaul of the framework for SCTC, that employees are going to be best protected, and that stricter policies and adherence to accountability and oversight are in place so that SDTC can carry out its mandate and, as you mentioned before, be able to serve a lot of really important companies in the clean tech sector?
I think one of the things with this whole McCarthy-Tetreault thing is, as much as the committee member says that the report is legitimate, I think there's a lot of long-term anger within employees about how all of that turned out, and that, some of these implicated individuals below the executive level being moved into this organization, there's a lot of bad blood that's going to stay there. And again, there still hasn't been a reconciliation of the actual abuses that occurred. So until that actually happens, all that's going to happen is, okay, the same people that were abusing on SDTC side are now going to be at NRC, and now they have a bigger pool of employees to abuse or, do bad things against. So transparency seems to be an issue that can't be addressed by the current government. So again, it's like I can give unlimited things that sound logical, but until the government proves that they're actually going to be transparent about what they're doing, they haven't even given the RCGT report to the committee. They haven't even released it to the public. All of these things that supposedly exonerate everyone and supposedly should be giving confidence, there's no proof of any confidence right now. And again, we wouldn't be having this committee meeting if there was actual transparency to the situation.
You've made some pretty serious claims about the work of McCarthy's, and I'm just curious, do you believe that they're trying to participate in a cover-up with the work that they're doing in this report?
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Okay. No further questions.
Thank you very much. Suivant, c'est Madame Sinclair Desgagnés.
Madame Sinclair Desgagnés, you have 2.5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. 2 brief questions for the witness. First off, you shared that during the McCarthy investigation or work, the employees that took part in those questioning from SDTC, how was this list disclosed? How are you made aware of it? Do you have any evidence to that effect?
Well, yeah, when I participated in it, it showed me that, again, what was told to everyone was that this investigation was going to be confidential and that no one from the SDTC executive team would know about what was happening. But for everyone that participated, especially the ones who had NDAs, it was like there was a online response that showed that it was the executives at SDTC who were approving the ability for employees to participate. And on top of that, when McCarthy was asking for certain records on the HR side, they were going to executives and SDTC HR to ask for those records. So again, there wasn't any sort of independence that would protect employees around the integrity of the investigation from day one.
Avez-vous des courriels à cet effet ou quelque chose qui pourrait...
Do you have any emails to that effect or anything that could help parliamentarians to show evidence of that? And can you share that?
Correct. I have my own
Parfait,
emails,
merci.
and there's multiple emails that show that there were other employees, current and former, that asked these questions, and they were ignored by McCarthy.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. For purpose of clarification, I'd like to get back to one of the points that you made regarding the freeze in funding for some of these companies as of October of last year. Some of these companies, or some, have contacted me, and they had already been approved, had received an amount, and that company's receiving nothing and has not received anything since October of last year. There's a slight discrepancy there. You were mentioning that some could have been approved at the board, but there's something I'm missing here with respect to the freeze for those companies that had been pre-approved.
So the way that works is a company can, let's say, be approved for $5 million. Once they've agreed to that amount, it's given out over a 3 to 5 year period.
Right.
So
Exact.
for certain companies, they might have already been approved and already received money. And had they maybe submitted a request for their next milestone payment prior to the spring of this year, they would have received it. So again, they fell into the bad timing where even if they were approved, and it really depended on at what time did they request their next tranche of funding. And if they requested it in the early part of this year, even though publicly ISED said that everything was fine and, they're only stopping new projects, those dispersals for legitimate companies who did nothing wrong were also stopped. So again, this is where it's not just a mismanagement of the truth, it's the mismanagement of actual legitimate companies that in potential cases, ISED themselves might have pushed them into bankruptcy or having to lay people off because of how ineffective they've been in managing the situation.
Et voilà, merci beaucoup. Suivant.
That's it. Thank you.
2.5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you again to the witness for being present here today and helping us in our study related to SDTC. I understand your frustration. I'm frustrated as well with the very real fact that it seems as though the government doesn't take these claims as seriously as you do, or as I do, as others do, in relation to the serious HR complaints that are present within, or were present within, the former SDTC. It's disturbing. And to be very frank, I'm upset to know that the evidence you submitted here today via your testimony regarding racism, anti-2S LGBTQ rhetoric within the department went without support for so long. And I know there's many victims of this, and to them I want them to know that I hear that, and I would hope that the government does its best efforts to ensure that there's justice for those victims. I want to move now to the serious issue related to the transition from the former SDTC to the new entity that's being spearheaded by ISED. ISED officials were present in this committee not long ago. I had asked a very poignant question related to two facts. One, there is an existing list of companies that are found in conflict of interest. My second question was, is it responsible for the government to reclaim those funds? I'll ask you the same question. Do you believe it's responsible for the government, at the very least, I know the damage has already been done, but to recoup those costs that were awarded to companies based on conflict of interest?
Absolutely.
It's imperative in my mind that this be something that's core to the recommendations of this study and core to the work of trying to rebuild public trust in institutions, is making sure we get some of this money back. And I know with the committee's support here, we can hopefully entertain such a recommendation later on. In addition to that, the new ISED organization that will be taking in this work, what recommendations do you have to them for two things? One, the direct support for employees, a better management system for HR, for example, and two, how we reduce these kinds of conflicts of interest moving forward. What are your recommendations to the new department?
I think the movement into the federal government will be fine on the conflict of interest because, one of the things that didn't exist at SDTC was the channels that exist for federal employees.
Sorry, just because of time, that's really important what you just said. Moving this from an arm's length agency established in 2001 that has no accountability is actually better suited to be put into the public service, because the public service, the federal government, within its own system, has more systems, including a union.
Exactly.
Wouldn't you agree?
Exactly.
Yeah, the union, if there was a union in this case, like the Public Service Alliance of Canada, this may have never happened if employees had the option to go to their union, correct?
I know for a fact that none of the problems at SDTC would have happened if they were public sector employees protected under the union rights that exist.
Thank you very much for your testimony today.
That is your time. Mr. Cooper, you have the floor for 5 minutes, please. This will be your last slot.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. During this so-called cleanup period at SDTC, updated contribution agreements have been completed. You indicated in your testimony that the effect of these contribution agreements is to make retroactive what were previously ineligible or conflicted projects eligible. To be clear, these contribution agreements, these updated contribution agreements, are prepared by ICIT. Is that correct?
Yes.
And they would have to be signed off by the minister, Minister Champagne, correct?
Correct.
Okay, thank you for that. Astounding. The Auditor General found, turning to COVID relief bonuses and payments, the Auditor General found that the SDTC Board improperly approved $38.5 million in so-called COVID relief payments. In addition, the Auditor General found that in blatant conflicts of interest, board members voted to funnel millions of dollars of these payments into their own companies 63 times, 63 conflicts of interest, and the SDTC board chair, Annette Verschaeren, was found guilty of violating the Conflict of Interest Act by the Ethics Commissioner for funneling nearly $220,000 of these payments into her own company. These payments were approved days before the end of fiscal year 2019-20 and 2020-21, correct?
Correct.
Is it correct that board members and executives were incentivized with bonuses if SDTC met certain funding goals in a fiscal year, in other words, getting money out the door?
Correct.
I would note that immediately prior to the approval of the so-called COVID relief payments in both fiscal years, SDTC had fallen short of meeting its funding goals. Is it fair to say that this nearly $40 million improper COVID giveaway had an impact on bonuses that board members received?
Can I say more than just correct?
Yes.
A lot of this COVID relief payments, it's not just a conflict of interest. They could have approved this payment, and that would have just it would have provided more of the funding that was already pre-approved. So all you were doing was adding in 5% that was already provided. For these COVID payments, they added additional 5%. So this is where they went above and beyond the logic of what you should have been doing, because even if the companies had a problem, you could have just provided them more of what was provided already, but instead they chose to add additional components of funding that never met any eligibility.
Right. And did that impact their bonuses?
Exactly.
Yes.
It impacted their bonuses.
So essentially, let me just clarify, if you would agree, board members voted to improperly funnel money out the door, including into their own companies, so that they could then turn around and pad their pockets with even more money in the way of bonuses. Is that a fair characterization of what happened?
For the case of Annette Verscharen's Enerstore in that second COVID payment, in the same few days that she received that second COVID payment, her company was already in the process of getting over $200,000 as part of the regular SDTC process. So again, this is a question of knowing better, not just illegally approving funding.
Now, Annette Verscharen at committee has attempted to justify these improper and conflict-ridden payments on the basis that companies within SDTC's portfolio were badly struggling during COVID and needed emergency funding to survive. But that's not accurate, is it?
SDTC actually did a complete survey of the whole portfolio, which showed that the majority of companies didn't require additional funding, including the majority of the board members' companies, which is why they then went ahead and approved it for everyone, because had they done a more effective job, it wouldn't have given the majority of SDTC companies and the board members' companies any money.
How much time?
About 45 seconds.
Okay. I just want to turn very quickly to Ed Vandenberg. He was provided counsel to the SDTC board, notwithstanding the fact that he was a member of the council. Is that correct?
Correct, and he's also conveniently retired.
And he was being remunerated, right?
Correct.
And that would be in violation of the SDTC Act.
Correct.
Did Annette Verscharen know of that?
She did.
And what about the Assistant Deputy Minister Noseworthy?
They would all know this.
And presumably Minister Champagne would have known of it as well.
I don't think so.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cooper. And finally, Ms. Bradford, you have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You've stated, actually, that McCarthy corrupted the review process. Can you please provide any records, emails, communication on ISET or McCarthy impeding employees, former or currently employed at SDTC, in participating with the McCarthy review?
Only on the condition that McCarthy also provide all of those similar communications.
I'm not sure we have the authority to do that, but I'm asking you if you can provide your records. So I don't know as you get to dictate the terms under which you do that. You've made these allegations, so I think it's fair that you would provide the proof to the committee. It's you that's making the allegations. So again, if it implies McCarthy, well then it implies McCarthy.
Sorry, what was the question again?
Okay. So because you've stated that McCarthy corrupted the review process, can you provide any records, emails, or communication on ISET or McCarthy impeding employees, former or currently employed at SDTC, in participating in the McCarthy review?
Can you describe what your understanding of what my definition of corruption was?
Well, I corrupted the review process. You're alleging that they prevented some people from participating and encouraged others to, meaning that they would skew the whole results. So we're asking you to provide the records that would back up those allegations.
So for that situation, again, as I've mentioned, people are under NDA, and how am I supposed to, technically I shouldn't even know that they tried to do this because they were under NDA. So again, I don't know, you're kind of trapping me in something that I cannot do unless they are released from their NDA. So I would agree to do this as long as everyone gets their NDAs removed.
So how did you know, how did you become aware of it?
Because they broke their NDAs and told me.
Pardon?
Because they broke their NDAs to tell me.
Oh, I see, the employees that were, okay. What about any records pertaining to ISET manipulating McCarthy's findings? Because that's another allegation you've made, that ISET actually tried to manipulate the findings of McCarthy. So we would need to see that. That shouldn't involve any NDAs by employees.
I would mention the disclaimer that I've mentioned several times as proof, because again, if they are saying that it wasn't manipulated, why do they have a disclaimer saying that it was?
Okay, I have no further questions. Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you. I will say this to the witness. If there's other documents that you wish to table, we will certainly accept them. Anything with respect to either the department or the ministry. So I know there was a bit of back and forth there. Things, upon reflection, if you feel there's documents you have that you can share with us, I think the members from all sides would appreciate that. Without further ado, we are out of time. I want to thank witness number 1 for participating today in the study of Report 6, Sustainable Development Technology Canada. I know you have agreed to table several documents. If you could do so through the clerk, we would appreciate it. And again, my offer stands. Should you discover additional documents that you feel reinforce your testimony or any of the questions today, we look forward to those. We're out of time, so I'm going to adjourn this meeting. We'll see you back here on Monday. Thank you very much. Have a great weekend.